When we think of ancient Rome, we often imagine marble statues and stoic senators, but Suetonius gives us something much more visceral. He was a high-ranking official, a personal secretary to the Emperor Hadrian, which meant he had access to the kind of information most people only dreamed of. His book, The Lives of the 12 Caesars, isn't a dry textbook. It's a collection of character studies that feel more like a series of high-stakes biographies. Suetonius isn't just interested in what these men did, he's obsessed with who they were, their habits, their physical flaws, their scandals, and their private madness. Through his eyes, we see the transformation of Rome itself, moving from a republic governed by laws and senatorial debate into a massive, often volatile, autocracy governed by the whims of individual men. It is important to remember that Suetonius wasn't writing a strict administrative history, he was a master of the juicy detail. He relied heavily on hearsay, gossip, and the kind of court rumors that would make a modern tabloid blush. While historians sometimes caution us that he prioritized drama over accuracy, that's exactly what makes the work so readable. He captures the psychological atmosphere of the imperial court, the terror, the vanity, and the sheer absurdity of absolute power. The story begins with the man who broke the old system, Julius Caesar. Suetonius paints a picture of a man driven by a relentless, almost divine sense of destiny. We see this early on, in a famous story where Caesar is captured by pirates. Instead of cowering, he treats them like subordinates, even demanding they increase his ransom because he's worth more than they realize. It's a glimpse into the audacity that would eventually lead him to cross the Rubicon and challenge the Senate. His life was a constant tension between his immense military success and his refusal to play by the rules of the Republic. He didn't just want to lead Rome, he wanted to embody it. When he was assassinated, he left behind a vacuum that the old Roman system simply wasn't designed to fill. That vacuum was filled by his heir, Augustus, and his reign is perhaps the most important in Roman history. If Caesar was the man who broke the world, Augustus was the man who rebuilt it. Suetonius describes a master of political pragmatism. Augustus wasn't a flashy conqueror in the way Caesar was, he was a survivor. He navigated a series of brutal civil wars, formed uneasy alliances like the Second Triumvirate, and eventually consolidated enough power to become the first true emperor. He was careful to keep the outward appearance of the Republic. The Senate still met, and the old titles remained. But the reality was entirely different. He had turned the machinery of state into a vehicle for his own authority, creating a stability that would last for generations, even if it meant the end of Roman political freedom. But stability is often an illusion, and Suetonius shows us how quickly that illusion can shatter. As the dynasty moved from Augustus to his successor, Tiberius, the tone of the narrative shifts from construction to decay. Tiberius was a capable general, but he was a man of deep, brooding isolation. His reign is a slow descent into paranoia. He eventually retreated to the island of Capri, leaving the actual business of governing Rome to others. While he was away, the capital became a landscape of fear. Suetonius describes a world of treason trials and judicial murders where ambitious men like Sejanus rose to power by feeding the emperor's suspicions. The domestic life of the imperial family became a battlefield of manipulation and betrayal, as Tiberius turned on his own kin, including his daughter, in-law Agrippina, and his own grandsons. This atmosphere of suspicion is most poignantly felt in the life of Germanicus. He was the nephew of Tiberius, a man of immense popularity and perceived virtue. He was everything the Roman people wanted in a leader, brave, generous, and seemingly untainted by the corruption of the court. But his death in the East, under highly suspicious circumstances, sent shockwaves through the empire. Suetonius uses Germanicus to show the growing rift between the people who loved him and the imperial court which feared his influence. His death was a turning point, a moment where the public realized that the emperor's power could be a predatory thing, even to those within the family. If Tiberius was the embodiment of cold, distant paranoia, his successor Caligula was the embodiment of erratic, explosive madness. Caligula's reign is one of the most vivid and terrifying parts of the book. He began his rule with great promise, welcomed as the son of the beloved Germanicus, but he quickly dissolved into a reign of pure extravagance and tyranny. Suetonius doesn't hold back on the details of his eccentricities, the rumors of his divinity, his obsession with turning his horse into a consul, and his total disregard for the dignity of the Roman state. Eventually, the chaos became too much, even for the people who had once cheered for him. He was assassinated by the Praetorian Guard, the very soldiers meant to protect him, in a violent end to a reign that had completely broken the decorum of the imperial office. The chaos following Caligula's death led to a period of intense instability, but it also produced one of Rome's most unexpected rulers, Claudius. For much of his life, Claudius had been dismissed by his family and the Roman elite as a physically and mentally infirm invalid. He was a man who was mocked for his mannerisms and his perceived weaknesses. Yet, when the chaos following Caligula's death left the throne vacant, Claudius managed to seize power. His reign proves a central theme in Suetonius's work, that the nature of absolute power can elevate even the most unlikely candidates. Claudius was a surprisingly effective administrator, but he lived in the shadow of a court that was constantly plotting against him, much like the one that had destroyed his predecessors. Following Claudius came Nero, whose reign would eventually lead to the collapse of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Nero's time on the throne is marked by a descent into artistic obsession and cruelty, ending in his own suicide. His death didn't bring immediate peace. Instead, it triggered the Year of the Four Emperors, a brutal scramble for power involving Galba, Otto, and Vitellius. This period of bloody transition highlights the fragility of the imperial system, when there is no clear legitimate heir. It was a time of total systemic failure, where the army, rather than the Senate or lineage, decided who would wear the purple. This cycle of chaos eventually found its way to Vespasian, a man who stands in stark contrast to the madness of the emperors who came before him. Vespasian was a man of humble origins, a soldier who rose through the ranks. He didn't rely on divine lineage or inherited mysticism to justify his rule. He relied on military competence and the restoration of order. After years of civil war and a depleted treasury, Vespasian brought a sense of pragmatic stability back to Rome. He was a builder and a stabilizer, focused on rebuilding the state's finances and its administrative foundations. His rise signaled a shift away from the unpredictable personalities of the early Julio-Claudian dynasty toward a more structured, professionalized imperial government, a legacy he passed on to his sons, Titus and Domitian. While the biographies of the emperors provide the political backbone of this specific work, Suetonius's broader interest in human nature extended far beyond the throne. In his other biographical writings, such as the lives of illustrious men, he weaves in a different kind of history through the lives of scholars, poets, and rhetoricians. These figures are not the rulers of the empire, but they are part of the same volatile world. Through them, we see the social mobility that the Roman Empire afforded to those with talent. We see freedmen, former slaves like the playwright Terence, rising to high social status through education and intellect. However, this mobility came with a heavy price. Suetonius shows us the precariousness of intellectual life under an autocracy. A poet's survival often depended on the shifting whims of a patron, and a scholar's status could vanish in an instant if they offended a powerful man. We see this clearly in the life of the poet Lucan. He was a man of immense talent and even greater vanity, whose life ended in a fatal clash with the tyranny of Nero. His suicide, forced by the emperor, serves as a grim reminder of the limits of influence in a world where power is absolute. On the other hand, we see figures like Horace, who managed to navigate the dangerous waters of imperial patronage with grace and skill. These stories provide a human counterweight to the grand movements of armies and the decrees of emperors. They remind us that the history of Rome wasn't just made in the Senate or on the battlefield, but in the libraries, the theatres, and the private villas of the intellectuals who lived in the shadow of the Caesars. When we step back and look at the whole of Suetonius's work, several patterns emerge. There is a recurring theme of the corruption of law. Under leaders like Tiberius and Caligula, the legal system was no longer a tool for justice, but a weapon for personal vendettas and a means of maintaining control. The law became whatever the emperor said it was. We also see the tension between divine legitimacy and political reality. The emperors went to great lengths to claim descent from gods like Venus, using omens and miracles to justify their rule. Yet the reality of their reigns was often defined by very human failings: greed, lust, and paranoia. There is also a profound paradox in the wealth and status that the empire offered. Suetonius frequently highlights how scholars and intellectuals could achieve incredible social heights, only to die in extreme poverty or in the middle of a political purge. The empire created a world of immense opportunity, but it was an opportunity built on a foundation of extreme volatility. Ultimately, The 12 Caesars is a study of how absolute power transforms everything it touches. It shows how the ambitions of a few individuals, men like Julius Caesar and Augustus, could fundamentally restructure the governance of an entire civilization. It shows how that same power, when concentrated in the hands of the unstable or the cruel, can lead to a breakdown of the very social fabric it was meant to protect. Suetonius gives us a portrait of Rome that is messy, scandalous, and deeply human. He doesn't just tell us what happened, he shows us the character of the men who made it happen, reminding us that history is often driven as much by individual temperament as it is by the grand movements of politics and war.